Hello friends, welcome to part 4 of my reading of Project 2025. As previously, I'm not going to edit out any mouth noises or mistakes or weird breaths. You're going to get everything as is. The last section was really dry. I hope this thing picks up soon. Page 60 in my PDF, page 28 of the actual book. Staff Secretary. The office of the Staff Secretary is rarely visible to the outside world, but it performs work of tremendous importance. The office is similar to a military commander's adjutant, as it is responsible for fielding and managing a vast amount of information at the top of its organization. This includes information on its way into the Oval Office, as well as information flowing out from the Oval Office. Because of its gatekeeping function, the position of Staff Secretary is one of extreme trust, and the individual who possesses it should be vetted to work as an honest broker in the President's service. The office of the Staff Secretary has been described as the last substantive control point before papers reach the Oval Office. A great deal of information is headed toward the Oval Office at any moment. This includes presidential decision memos, bills passed by Congress, which may be accompanied by signing or veto statements, and briefing books, reading materials, samples of constituent mail, personal mail, and drafts of speeches. The Staff Secretary makes certain that these materials are complete, well-ordered, and up to date before they reach the President. This necessarily means that the Staff Secretary plays a key role in determining who weighs in on policy matters and when. As noted above, the Staff Secretary also handles information leaving the Oval Office. The President may have questions after reviewing incoming material, may wish to seek more information, or may demand revisions. The Staff Secretary is often responsible for directing these requests to the appropriate places and following up on them to ensure that they are completed. One of the Staff Secretary's critical functions is managing and overseeing the clearance process for the President's daily and nightly briefing book. This book is filled with all the reading material and leading documentation the President needs in the morning and the evening to help him make decisions. The Staff Secretary also oversees the use of the President's signature, whether by hand or by autopen, and manages the Office of the Executive Clerk, Office of Records Management, and Office of Presidential Correspondence. Office of Communications. The Office of Communications, which operates under the Director of Communications, conveys the President's agenda to the public through various media, including speeches and remarks, press briefings, off-the-record discussions with reporters, and social media. Depending on how a president chooses to structure his White House, the Office of Communications may include the Office of the Press Secretary, Press Office. But no matter how it is structured, the office must work closely with the Press Office, as well as the President's speechwriters and digital strategists. Operational functions of the Office of Communications include scheduling and running press briefings, interviews, meetings, media appearances, speeches, and a range of other events. The Office of Communications must maintain robust relationships with the White House Press Corps, the White House Correspondents Association, regional stakeholders, and key interest groups. No legal entitlement exists for the provision of permanent space for media on the White House campus, and the next administration should re-examine the balance between media demands and space constraints on the White House premises. Leadership within the Office of Communications should include a communications director, who is a direct report to the Chief of Staff, a deputy communications director, a deputy director for strategic communications, and a press secretary. This leadership team must work together closely to drive the national narrative about the White House. The best resource for the Office of Communications is the President. The President conveys the White House's overall message through one or two inaugural addresses, State of the Union addresses, speeches to Congress, and press conferences. The office must also ensure that the various White House offices disseminate a unified message to the public. The communications director and press secretary in particular should be careful to avoid contradicting the president or delivering conflicting information. The speechwriting team is a critical component of the communications team. Speechwriting is a unique talent. The writers selected must understand policy, should have a firm grasp of history and other liberal arts disciplines, and should be able to learn and adopt the president's style of rhetoric and mode of delivery. The press secretary is the president's spokesperson, communicating to the American people through the media. The press secretary engages with the White House press corps formally through press briefings and informally through impromptu gaggles and meetings. And yes, I did almost try to say the press secretary enrages the White House press corps. That's applicable to Catherine Leavitt. Individuals who serve in this role must be quick on their feet, which means, when appropriate, deftly refuting and rebutting correspondents' questions and comments. The communications director must convey the president's mission to the American people. Especially for conservatives, this means navigating the mainstream media to ensure that the president's agenda is conveyed effectively and accurately. The communications director must be politically savvy and very aware of the ongoing activities of other White House offices. The new administration should examine the nature of the relationship between itself and the White House Correspondents Association and consider whether an alternative coordinating body might be more suitable. Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA. Created by President Dwight Eisenhower, the OLA has continued to serve as the liaison between the White House and Congress. The White House must work with congressional leaders to ensure presidential nominees for roles such as cabinet secretaries and ambassadors are confirmed by the Senate. The White House also relies on Congress to enact reforms promised by the president on the campaign trail, whether those promises relate to health care, education, or national defense. Because Congress holds the power of the purse, White House staffers must ensure that there is enough support on the Hill to secure the necessary funding through the appropriations process to fulfill the president's agenda. The OLA reports directly to the Chief of Staff, and in some administrations has done so under the guidance of a Deputy Chief of Staff, usually the Deputy Chief for Policy. Regardless of the person to whom the OLA reports, however, the office exercises a certain autonomy on behalf of the President and the Chief of Staff in directly influencing congressional leaders of both major political parties. The OLA often must function as a mediator among the parties and find common ground to facilitate the successful enactment of the President's agenda. As is the case with many White House offices, but especially the Office of Communications, the OLA must ensure that congressional leaders receive one unified message. If other actors within the White House maintain their own relationships with congressional leaders and staffers, it may appear that the president's agenda is fractured and lacks consensus. This dynamic has caused real problems for many presidents in the past. Internally, OLA staffers need to be involved in policy discussions, budget reviews, and other important meetings. They must also provide advice to policy staffers regarding whether certain ideas are politically feasible. Externally, OLA staffers have to communicate continuously with congressional offices of both parties in both the House and the Senate to ensure that the president has enough support to enact his legislative priorities or sustain votes. The OLA requires staffers who are effectively communicators and can provide a dose of reality to other White House staffers when necessary. Although a policy proposal from within the White House may be a great idea, OLA staffers must ensure that it is politically feasible. OLA staffers must therefore be skilled in both politics and policy. Furthermore, the president should seek out individuals who can advance his agenda and at the same time forge pathways with members of the opposing political party on other priorities. Most important, the OLA must function as a well-oiled machine, precisely synced. The president cannot afford to have a tennis player on, much less as the leader of, his football team. That's a weird way to end that section. Office of President Personnel, PPO. The political axiom that personnel is policy was popularized under President Ronald Reagan during the 1981 presidential transition. One of the most important offices in the White House is the PPO, which was created under President Richard Nixon to centralize political appointments. Departments and agencies had and still have direct legal authority on hiring and firing, but the power to fill Schedule C positions, the core of political jobs, is vested with the president. Therefore, the White House, not the department or agency, has the final word on political appointments. PPO's primary responsibility is to staff the executive branch with individuals who are equipped to implement the president's agenda. Although its focus should be identifying and recruiting leaders to fill the approximately 1,000 appointments that require Senate confirmation, PPO must also fill approximately 3,000 political jobs that require dedicated conservatives to support the administration's political leadership. Frequently, many medium-tier and top-tier jobs have been filled by policy experts tasked with accomplishing much of the work of the administration. At the same time, appointees in the entry-level jobs have brought invaluable energy and commitment to the White House and have proved to be the farm team for the conservative movement. The Office of Presidential Personnel is responsible for identifying potential political personnel both actively through recruitment and passively by fielding resumes and adjudicating requests from political actors. Vetting potential political personnel by conducting political background checks and reviewing any clearance and fitness assessments by departments and agencies. Making recommendations to the President and to other appointment authorities on behalf of the President. Identifying programmatic political workforce needs early and developing plans, for example, Schedule F. Maintaining a strong relationship with the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, both for operational purposes and to effectuate the President's direct Title V authorities. The President is in charge of the federal workforce and exercises control principally by working through the Director of the Office of Personnel Management. Training and connecting political personnel. Playing bad cop in a way that other White House offices cannot, including serving as the office that takes direct responsibility for firings and hirings. Serving as a personnel link between conservative organizations and the executive branch. In most administrations, PPO will staff more than 100 positions during a transition and thousands of non-career positions during the President's first term. Direct authority and a strong relationship with the President are necessary attributes for any PPO director. Historically, PPO has had direct review and control of personnel files, including security clearance dossiers. At the highest level, PPO is tasked with long-term strategic workforce development. The billets of political appointments are of immense importance in credentialing and training future leaders. In addition, whatever one's view of the constitutionality of various civil service rules, for example, the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998 might be, it is necessary to ensure that departments and agencies have robust cadres of political staff just below senior levels in the event of unexpected vacancies. Office of Political Affairs, OPA. The OPA is the primary office within the executive branch for managing the President's political interests. Although its specific functions vary from administration to administration, the OPA typically serves as the liaison between the President and associated political entities, national committees, federal and state campaigns, and interest groups. Within legal guidelines, the OPA engages in outreach, conducts casework, and, if the President is up for re-election, assists with his campaign. The OPA may also monitor congressional campaigns, arrange presidential visits with other political campaigns, and recommend campaign staff to the Office of Presidential Personnel for service in the executive branch. The OPA further serves as a line of communication between the White House and the President's political party. This includes both relaying the President's ambitions to political interests and listening to the needs of political interests. This relationship allows for the exchange of information between the White House and political actors across the country. The OPA should have one Director of Political Affairs who reports either to the Chief of Staff or to a Deputy Chief of Staff. The OPA should also include various deputy directors, each of whom is responsible for a certain geographical region of the country. Because nearly all White House activities are in some way inherently political, the OPA needs to be aware of all presidential actions and activities, including travel, policy decisions, speeches, nominations, and responses to matters of national security, and consider how they might affect the President's image. The OPA must therefore have a designated staffer who communicates not only with other White House offices, but also with the Cabinet and executive branch agencies. Office of Cabinet Affairs, OCA. The OCA's role has changed to some degree over the course of various administrations, but its overriding function remains the same, to ensure the coordination of policy and communication between the White House and the Cabinet. Most important, The OCA coordinates all cabinet meetings with the President. It should also organize and administer regular meetings of the Deputy Secretaries, because they also typically serve vital roles in the departments and agencies, and, further, often become acting secretaries when cabinet members resign. There should be one cabinet secretary who reports to the Chief of Staff's office, either directly or through a deputy chief, according to the chief's preference and focus. The cabinet secretary maintains a direct relationship with all members of the cabinet. The OCA further consists of deputies and special assistants who work with each department's principal, deputy secretary, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and other senior staff. The OCA also connects the departments to WHO offices. The OCA coordinates with the Chief of Staff's office and the Office of Communications to promote the President's agenda through the cabinet departments and agencies. The Cabinet's communications staffers are obviously another critical component of this operation. In prior administrations, the OCA has played a vital role by tracking the President's agenda for the Chief of Staff, deputy chiefs, and senior advisors. It has worked with each department and agency to advance policy priorities. In the future, amplifying this function would truly benefit both the President and the conservative movement. From time to time throughout an administration, travel optics, ethics challenges, and Hatch Act issues involving cabinet members, deputies, and senior staffers can arise. The OCA is normally tasked with keeping the WHO informed of such developments and providing support if and when necessary. The ideal cabinet secretary will have exceptional organizational skills and be a seasoned political operative or attorney. Because many cabinet officials have been former presidential candidates, governors, ambassadors, and members of Congress, the ideal candidate should also possess the ability to interact with and persuade accomplished individuals. Office of Public Liaison, OPL. The OPL is critically important in building coalitions and support for the President's agenda across every aligned social, faith-based, minority, and economic interest group. It is a critical tool for shaping public opinion and keeping myriad supporters, as well as frenemies and opponents alike who are within reach, better informed. The OPL is a notably large office. It should have one director who reports to the Chief of Staff's office, either directly or through a deputy, according to the chief's preference and focus. The director must maintain relationships not only with other WHO heads, but also with the senior staff of every cabinet department and agency. Since a president's agenda is always in motion, it is important for the OPL to facilitate listening sessions to receive the views of the various leaders and members of key interest groups. The OPL should also have a sufficient number of deputies and special assistants to cover the vast number of disparate interest groups that are engaged daily. The OPL has, by far, held more meetings in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, EEOB, and within the West Wing itself than any other office within the WHO. The OPL is the chief White House enforcer and gatekeeper among these various interest groups. It is operated best whenever the Chief of Staff has given it permission to use both the proverbial carrot and the proverbial stick. To make this work, communication with the Chief's office is vital. Additionally, the OPL has had an outsized role in presidential scheduling and both official and political travel. The OPL director should come from the president's election campaign or Capitol Hill, but should not have deeply entrenched connections to a K Street entity or any other potential stakeholder. Some prior relationships can create real or perceived biases toward one group or another. The director should be amiable, gregarious, highly organized, and willing to shoulder criticism and pushback from interest groups and other elements of the administration. Unlike the director, OPL deputies and special assistants need a deep understanding of the Capitol, from K Street to Capitol Hill. They should have extensive experience in private industry, the labor sector, the conservative movement, and among the specific interest groups with which they will be asked to engage on behalf of the White House. OPL staffers work with more external and internal parties than any other WHO staffers. In turn, they must be effective communicators and initiative takers. They must also be able to influence, persuade, and most important, listen to various stakeholders and ensure that they feel heard. All OPL staffers must understand from the outset that their jobs might be modified or even phased out entirely as the administration's priorities change. I had no idea that so much of the first section of Project 2012 would be explaining how government works in the White House. Bored yet? I'll keep going. Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, IGA. The IGA connects the White House to state, county, local, and tribal governments. In other words, it is the one-stop shop for disseminating an administration's agenda to all non-federal government entities. The IGA should have a director to whom one or two deputy directors report. The director must ensure that the White House remains connected to all non-federal government entities. The interests and perspectives of these entities are represented in policy discussions, organized events with the West Wing, EOP senior staff, and IGA staff throughout the departments and agencies. The IGA can be staffed in a variety of ways, but two arrangements are most common. Each deputy and that deputy staffers are responsible for a type of government. A group of staffers is responsible for a specific geographical region of the country. The IGA, as suggested above, represents the interests and perspectives of non-federal government entities, but its primary job is to make sure that these entities understand an administration's agenda and ultimately support it. The IGA must work with all other White House offices, especially the OPA and the OPL, and manage its staff throughout the departments and agencies. IGA staffers must therefore have communication skills, understand political nuance, and be willing to engage in complex policy discussions. They should also be not just generally responsive, but also proactive in seeking out the interests and perspectives of non-federal government entities. White House Policy Councils. As the federal government has ballooned in size over the past century, it has become increasingly difficult for the president alone to direct his agenda across the executive branch. 3 White House Policy Councils have come into existence to help the president to control the bureaucracy and ensure continued alignment between agency leadership and White House priorities. Those councils, as previewed above, are the NSC, NEC, and DPC. Each is headed by an assistant to the president and performs 3 significant functions. Policy coordination. The primary role of the policy councils is to coordinate the development of administration policy. This frequently includes developing significant legislative priorities, coordinating policy decisions that impact multiple departments and agencies, and at times, coordinating policy decisions within a single department or agency. This process must ensure that all relevant offices are included, that competing or conflicting opinions are thoroughly discussed and evaluated, and, when there is disagreement among White House senior staff or among cabinet members, a well-structured question is presented to the president for an intermediate or final decision. Policy advice. By virtue of working in the White House, the heads of the 3 policy councils will also function as independent policy advisors to the president. This aspect of the role will vary depending on the individual in this position and the president's governing philosophy. Incumbents have ranged from honest brokers, who mostly coordinate and ensure that all opinions are fairly presented to the president, to policy deciders, who largely drive a given policy topic on behalf of the president. Policy implementation. The policy councils also manage and mediate the implementation of previous policy decisions. Implementation of a new statute or an executive order frequently takes years and involves many distinct and more granular policy decisions along the way. It is essential to have a centralized process for evaluating and coordinating these decisions, especially if they involve more than one cabinet department or agency with differing opinions on the best approach for securing the president's goals. The above functions have recently been managed by policy councils through a tiered interagency policy process. This process helps to identify differences of opinion and reach a decision without having to take every issue to the president. It can be used to address a single question or monitor a recurring issue on an ongoing basis. Typically, the process involves multiple cabinet departments and agencies that have a pertinent role, policy interest, or disagreement. Each policy council's process could involve the following conditions. Policy Coordinating Committee, PCC. A PCC is led by a special assistant to the President from the Policy Council and includes political assistant secretary level experts from the relevant departments, agencies, or offices. The purpose is to determine where consensus exists, clearly identify where there are differing opinions, and develop options for resolving the remaining questions. If no outstanding questions or disagreements exist, the PCC may resolve the issue and move toward implementation at the agency level. Deputies Committee, DC. A DC is a meeting of presidential... You know what? I need a drink of my beverage. Tonight we are having Lismore Scotch with pomegranate juice and sparkling water. Oh, and beet powder. There's a little bit of beet powder in there. Supposedly it's good for my blood pressure. We'll see what happens when I get to the meat of this document. Deputies Committee, DC. A DC is a meeting of presidentially appointed executives chaired by the Policy Council's deputy assistant to the President and relevant deputy secretaries. It evaluates the options produced by the PCC and frequently directs the PCC to add, expand, or re-evaluate an option or even to reach a compromise and resolve an issue at that level. Principals Committee, PC. When questions are not resolved by a DC, the Director of the Policy Council will chair a PC, which is attended by the relevant cabinet secretaries and senior White House political staff. This is the final opportunity for the President's most senior advisors to discuss the question, make sure that each principal's position is carefully understood, and see whether consensus or a compromise might be reached. If not, the Chief of Staff's office will schedule time for the PC to meet with the President for a final decision. Despite having seemingly clear and separate portfolios, the three policy councils frequently have areas of overlap, which can result in confusion, duplication, or conflict. For example, there are areas of immigration and border security, either NSC or DPC, healthcare, energy, and the environment, either NEC or DPC, and trade and international economic policy, either NSC or NEC. Identifying these potentially problematic areas and assigning policy responsibilities to only one council where possible will help to speed up the policy coordination process. While other chapters will cover specific policy goals for each department or agency, incoming policy councils will need to move rapidly to lead policy processes around cross-cutting agency topics, including countering China, enforcing immigration laws, reversing regulatory policies in order to promote energy production, combating the left's aggressive attacks on life and religious liberty, and confronting wokeism throughout the federal government. National Security Council. The NSC is intended to be an interdepartmental body within the White House that can set national security policy with a whole-of-government approach. Unlike other policy councils, the NSC was established by statute. Statutory members and advisors who are currently part of the NSC include the President and the Vice President, Secretaries of State, Defense and Energy, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Director of National Intelligence. The NSC staff, and particularly the National Security Advisor, should be vetted for foreign and security policy experience and insight. The National Security Advisor and NSC staff advise the President on matters of foreign policy and national security, serve as an information conduit in times of crisis, and as liaisons, ensuring that written communications are properly shared among NSC members. Special attention should be given to the use of detailees to staff the NSC. In recent years, the NSC's staff size has been right-sided from its peak of 400 in 2015 down to 100 to 150 professional members. The next administration should try to limit the number of detailees to ensure more direct presidential control. National Economic Council. The NEC was established in 1993 by executive order and has four key functions: to coordinate the economic policy making process with respect to domestic and international economic issues, to coordinate economic policy advice to the President, to ensure that policy decisions and programs are consistent with the President's stated goals and that those goals are being effectively pursued, to monitor implementation of the President's economic policy agenda. The NEC Director coordinates and implements the President's economic policy objectives by working with Cabinet Secretaries, their departments, and multiple agencies. The Director is supported by a staff of policy experts in various fields, including infrastructure, manufacturing, research and development, agriculture, small business, financial regulation, housing, technology and innovation, and fiscal policy. The NEC considers economic policy matters, and the DPC typically considers anything related to domestic matters, with the exception of economic policy matters. It also differs from the Council of Economic Advisors, CEA. Whereas the NEC is in charge of policy development, the CEA acts as the White House's internal research arm for economic analysis. It is therefore critically important to find people with the right qualifications to head both the NEC and the CEA. The CEA is almost always led by a well-known academic economist, and the NEC is regularly led by someone with expertise in directing the President's economic policy process. Those who have served in the role have ranged from former CEOs of the nation's largest investment firms, to financial services industry managers, to seasoned congressional staffers who have managed the economic policy issues for top financial and tax writing committees. Domestic Policy Council. The Domestic Policy Council, DPC, have you memorized all these yet? Consists of advisors to the President on non-economic domestic policy issues, as well as international issues with a significant domestic component, such as immigration. It is one of the primary policy councils serving the President, along with the NSC and NEC. The Director serves as the principal DPC advisor to the President, along with members of the Cabinet, and the Deputy Director chairs the committee responsible for coordinating domestic policy development at the Deputy Secretary level. In this respect, both the Director and the Deputy Director have critical institutional functions that affect the development of domestic policy throughout the administration. The DPC also has policy experts, for example, Special Assistants to the President, or SAPs, who are responsible for developing and coordinating, as well as for advising the President on specific issues. It is essential that DPC policy expertise reflect the most prominent issues that are before the administration. Issues such as the environment, healthcare, housing, and immigration. In addition, DPC SAPs should demonstrate a working knowledge of the rulemaking process, although they need not necessarily be experts on regulation, because a working knowledge of the rulemaking process will facilitate the DPC's effectiveness in coordinating administration policy. The DPC also needs to work closely with other offices within the Executive Office of the President to promote economic opportunity and private sector innovation. This includes working with the Office of Management and Budget and its Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, as well as the Council of Economic Advisors, Council on Environmental Quality, and Office of Science and Technology Policy. To this end, the Director should chair a standing meeting with the principals from each of the other EOP offices to enhance coordination from within the White House. Several areas will be especially important as the DPC works to develop a well-defined domestic policy agenda. One is the promotion of innovation as a foundation for economic growth and opportunity. The President should establish an Economic Opportunity Working Group, chaired by the DPC Director, to coordinate the development of policies that promote economic opportunity. Another important area is the promotion of healthcare reform to bring down costs for the American people and the pressure that spending on health programs puts on the federal budget. Finally, DPC should coordinate with the NSC on a policy agenda to enhance border security. Office of the Vice President, OVP. In modern U.S. history, the Vice President has acted as a significant advisor to the President. Once elected, the VP helps to promote and, in many instances, put into place and execute the President's agenda. The President may additionally determine the inclusion of OVP staff in White House meetings, including Policy Coordinating Committee, Deputies Committee, and Principals Committee discussions. and Principals Committee discussions, as has been done in various recent administrations. Recent presidents have decided to give vice presidents space in the West Wing. The VP's proximity to the president, as well as to the chief of staff and additional senior advisors, makes his or her role a powerful one within the West Wing. It's interesting. This is the first time this writer has used or her. Every other role regarding the president has been him. Presidents typically tap VPs to lead various administration efforts. These efforts have included serving on the NSC Principals Committee, heading the National Space Council, addressing immigration and border issues, leading the response to healthcare crises, and supervising workforce programs. VPs traditionally also spearhead projects of personal interest that have been authorized by the president. The VP is also charged with breaking tie votes in the Senate, and in recent years has served abroad as a brand ambassador for the White House and more broadly the United States, announcing administration priorities and coordinating with heads of state and other top foreign government officials. The Vice President, as President of the Senate, could be a president's emissary to the Senate. Office of the First Lady / First Gentleman. Now that's cute. Like conservatives would ever elect a woman. The First Lady or First Gentleman plays an interesting role in the formation, implementation, and execution of policy in concert with the president. Active and interested first spouses often champion a select number of signature issues, whether they be thorny social issues or deeper policy issues. One advantage of the first spouses taking on hot-button social issues is that any political backlash will be less severe than it would be for the president. The first spouse normally appoints a chief of staff who has enough assistants to support the spouse's activity in the East Wing of the White House. This group works exclusively with the first spouse and senior members of the White House, along with EOP personnel, to implement and execute the first spouse's priorities, which reflect the first spouse's passions and interests and are often identified as important in discussions with the president. Executed well, they can be strategically useful in accelerating the administration's agenda. Past East Wing initiatives have focused on such issues as combating bullying, fighting drug abuse, promoting literacy, and encouraging physical education for young adults and children. The first spouse is afforded significant resources. His or her staff also works with the president's policy team, members of the cabinet, and other EOP staff. The author thanks contributors to the chapter. There's a bunch of resources. Hey, look at this. We're on to another section. Executive Office of the President of the United States by Russ Vought. In its opening words, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution makes it abundantly clear that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. That enormous power is not vested in departments or agencies, in staff or administrative bodies, in non-governmental organizations, or other equities and interests close to the government. The President, italicized, must set and enforce a plan for the executive branch. Sadly, however, a president today assumes office to find a sprawling federal bureaucracy that all too often is carrying out its own policy plans and preferences, or worse yet, the policy plans and preferences of a radical, supposedly woke faction of the country. The modern conservative president's task is to limit, control, and direct the executive branch on behalf of the American people. This challenge is created and exacerbated by factors like Congress's decades-long tendency to delegate its lawmaking power to agency bureaucracies, the pervasive notion of expert independence that protects so-called expert authorities from scrutiny, the presumed inability to hold career civil servants accountable for their performance, and the increasing reality that many agencies are not only too big and powerful, but also increasingly weaponized against the public, and a president who is elected by the people and empowered by the Constitution to govern. In Federalist number 47, James Madison warned that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Regrettably, that wise and cautionary note describes to a significant degree the modern executive branch, which, whether controlled by the bureaucracy or by the president, writes federal policy, enforces that policy, and often adjudicates whether that policy was properly drafted and enforced. The overall situation is constitutionally dire, unsustainably expensive, and in urgent need of repair. Nothing less than the survival of self-governance in America is at stake. The great challenge confronting a conservative president is the existential need for aggressive use of the vast powers of the executive branch to return power, including power currently held by the executive branch, to the American people. Success in meeting that challenge will require a rare combination of boldness and self-denial. Boldness to bend or break the bureaucracy to the president's will, and self-denial to use the bureaucratic machine to send power away from Washington and back to America's families, faith communities, local governments, and states. Fortunately, a president who is willing to lead will find in the executive office of the president, EOP, the levers necessary to reverse this trend and impose a sound direction for the nation on the federal bureaucracy. The effectiveness of these EOP levers depends on the fundamental premise that it is the president's agenda that should matter to the departments and agencies that operate under his constitutional authority, and that, as a general matter, it is the president's chosen advisors who have the best sense of the president's aims and intentions, both with respect to the policies he intends to enact and with respect to the interests that must be secured to govern successfully on behalf of the American people. This chapter focuses on key features and recommendations for several of the EOP's important components. So let's be clear. We're somehow giving the power back to the people by letting the president do whatever he wants. Huh? Alright, I'm going to stop here. Next section is titled U.S. Office of Management and Budget. I have a feeling that it's going to be another dry section at the beginning of Part 5. We shall see. And before I go, I'm taking another sip of my concoction. It's really delicious. The Lismore whiskey is lovely. It's $17-18 for a fifth at Trader Joe's. Delicious. This recording and all other recordings related to this Project 2025 reading are copyrighted by Douglas Wayne Ricketts. All rights reserved. Unless you agree with me that Project 2025 sucks, then please feel free to use as much of this reading as you want. Thanks for listening.